Hi,
Hey,
everyone.
good morning, everyone.
Hi. We got a nice big group today. I love it.
Yeah, we are popular.
So
And
yeah,
and we love having our panelists here because we have all been engaged for a very long time. So this has just been great.
hmm yeah, and so I just want to say congratulations to Shar. I mean, you're having it looks like you're getting a new place down in Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little town um, north of Puerto Vallarta.
Oh,
I can
great.
barely pronounce this name, but it's really kind of outside of town. But yeah, I'm excited, and it's just been a pleasure running my company remotely. And then my business partner and I travel back to Colorado once a month so that we can do an in-person meeting with our employees in person as well as Zoom. So it's not just Zoom. Um, so yeah, it's been a big learning experience, but I would tell you, doing this, I think a lot of business leaders are attempting to do similar things in this day and age and trying to move to a remote workforce.
Right. I think that's the interesting thing is just how much COVID has kind of forced us all to think more globally and interact globally with others. And so it's I think some of the positive things that the situation has brought us. So, but
Well, I'm glad to kind of be, I feel like I'm the test pilot of everything.
mhm.
I'm the test pilot of our TMA assessment tool, which is, we're working through some of the just adapting it to our company. But so far our company is thriving and we keep growing. And so even despite the COVID and all the craziness. so
That's great.
so something we're doing is working. And I think the people management strategies that I apply just by doing these forums I've been giving a lot of positive feedback by my fairly new managers that they see a very different way that we manage our employees compared to other employers.
Mhm.
So it's very rewarding.
Yeah, that's I think that's the big theme nowadays is to be more talent centric, be having more discussions and bringing the humanism back into work, and so that's a big reason why we have Dr. Dena Samuels with us today to talk to guide us on diversity and inclusion. So yeah, so thank you, Doctor. So I know that we have some people joining now, and we're going to be getting started at the top of the hour in about 5 minutes, and so we're just chatting right now. And so I'd like to say hi to Harold. It's always good to have Harold on, and he's
Hey, Harold.
one of our good followers there. So
Harold is this the same Harold that's relocating as well?
I'm not sure. No, Harold is I believe out of the
Singapore.
Singapore.
Singapore. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously you're talking about actual attendees.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's interesting moving to Mexico as well as being kind of a snowbird and living in Colorado. I'm noticing a major migration going on right now.
Oh, really?
Yes, I guess I'm informal. I'm not like doing research on this, guys. So, but Dr. Dena Samuels, I would assume the differences in the cultures and the way executive leaders are managing diversity and employment law in general is very fascinating for good and not so good. And I'm definitely seeing it firsthand here in Puerto Vallarta is where I live right now, and the way employees are treated. And so I hope someday we can get into a little bit more of a global discussion about the changes when it comes to employment law.
Oh, interesting.
Because I think that companies are changing very rapidly to a global expansion, but not necessarily keeping up with the laws in the different countries. So
Yeah.
I think that would be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, and one of my favorite people that is an expert in that area is Warren Heaps of the Birches Group, It's an an outfit out of the East, and he focuses on a lot of different practices and employee practices across the globe. And so there's a lot of experience there, and it's fascinating to hear the differences. Because and that's be a good conversation for us to have in the future, is about what is considered equal. And because equal is different. I mean, when you're talking about equal pay and different locations, I mean, it's not that easy. I mean, you can't pay a person the same that you pay them in the United States in different countries, because they have a different economy, a different basket of goods that they have to purchase. And so we had to think about what is equal but
Sure.
but fair, and those different.
Well, I
quite
would
complicated.
say that because my kitchen doesn't work so well, we go
Mhm.
out to eat a lot. So I would say they think we're pretty good tippers.
Yeah.
Because we tip like we live in America, and they're not used to that kind of tip. So,
Right.
but
Yeah.
we feel that it's a blessing, and just giving back to the local community that we tip well. And that goes for anyone helping us live remotely,
Mhm.
because I really am not sure what their wage levels are here in Mexico.
Yep.
And I think Sumit is indicated the same kind of perspectives in India, just a little bit different wage levels in India.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're just about to the top of the hour, so I'm going to start sharing my screen here, so we can get it kicked off.
Great.
All right, Jules, would you like to kick us off?
Love to. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We are so excited to have you here today at the People Strategies Forum. Whether you're tuning in from Facebook, LinkedIn, or here on Zoom, we are very excited to have you here. A little bit about the People Strategies Forum if you're new, which we're so excited if you are. We hope you keep coming back each week. It is a weekly webinar, and it's a mastermind of leaders that's dedicated to creating workplaces where people thrive, very important, where employees reward and customers love. So that's a little bit about what we try to do here. We bring new speakers each and every week, give you some fresh perspectives, and we are actually sponsored by TMA. So TMA, it's a great place to assess your talents, find out what you're good at, because if you don't know what you're good at, it's really hard to find the right work for you that aligns with your skills and talents. So if you stick around to the very end, we're actually going to show you a way that you can get a free assessment, and then you can hop in, you can do the quick assessment, find your talents, and then it'll help you know how you can actually leverage those to have a happier work life. Who doesn't want that? And we're very excited today because we have an awesome panel. You can see we have 5 awesome people, myself included. I include myself. And I like to break the ice. I'm very shy. And I'm an on-camera host and coach. I help people show up more confidently on camera, and I help host these discussions each week. We also have Shah here as well. If you were tuning in a little earlier, she's coming to us from Mexico, just bought a house there, so jealous. And she has over 20 years of HR experience. So she's an HR expert, people strategist with Comp Team. She runs her own consulting firm and has for the past couple of years. So she really has a lot of skills, especially in the areas of talent management, leadership training and development. We also have Sumit, who we have missed for the past couple of weeks. We're so happy to have you back. He's also a people strategist with Comp Team. He is also an HR expert, has a lot of experience in the world of HR. He's consulted for many large companies like Deloitte, and I'm going to kick it off over to Sam as well. Sam is the founder and CEO of Comp Team, and he puts all of this together so that we can meet up weekly, which is fantastic. And he is actually, he's got over 20 years of experience in total reward strategies. So he helps transform companies by optimizing their talent initiatives. So as you can see, we have a really solid team here with all kinds of special skills and talents. And our special guest speaker today is Dr. Dena Samuels. So let me take that back. Dr. Dena Samuels, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Awesome, welcome. We are so happy to have you. I know I wasn't there when you were here the first time, but Dr. Samuels is actually a returning speaker. She was so good the first time, we had to bring her on back. And
Absolutely.
A mindfulness-based diversity, equity, and inclusion author, speaker, leadership trainer, and consultant. She does a little bit of everything. I love it. She taught at the University of Colorado for 20 years and now consults full time. We're really excited to have her here today because we are talking about race at the workplace, which can be a bit of a sensitive topic. So it's really important we consult with an expert to help us kind of navigate this topic. And I know you don't have slides, so we're going to kind of keep it more as a Q&A today, I understand.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. So
while I'm seeing some more people jump on, fantastic. I want to let you all know as well, please write any comments you have, questions in the chat box. I'll be off camera looking for those, and I'll ask Dr. Samuels those questions as they pop up. And if you are on LinkedIn or Facebook or some other streaming platform, write those questions in as well, because we won't answer them live, but we will get them answered for you as well. All right, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Samuels. I can't wait to hear what you have to share with us today.
Thanks so much. I'm honored to be here and honored to be back. And thanks, Jules, for the warm welcome. And to all of you for being here and getting involved in this really important conversation today. Yeah.
yes, thank you so much, Dr. Dena Samuels. So tell us, how did you get involved in the work that you do? I mean, what was a spark that started all this in your career?
So actually, it started with my students. So I was teaching at the University of Colorado, and back in the day, early in my career, some of my students, I was teaching race theory. I'm a sociologist, and I was teaching race theory. And some of my students, I had already done, obviously, a lot of research around discrimination and those kinds of things. But some of my students, in fact, my white students, started to ask me questions that I just couldn't answer. And it was really stunning to me because I had been, I felt like I was coming to the classroom feeling sourced, right? That I felt like, oh, I've got some expertise or whatever. And they started asking questions that I was like, why has this never come up before in all of my schooling? Why has nobody ever talked about my whiteness and what that means in the world? And so that when you ask about a spark, that was it. So I ended up pausing and I went back to school basically, and basically got another master's. I mean, I didn't get a degree, but I started learning. I started soaking up the knowledge around what it means to be white in the United States anyway. And I already knew what it meant to be on the side of discrimination, just not from my whiteness, but from being Jewish, and identify as queer. I'm bisexual. And so I knew what that side of things looked like, but I didn't know what my whiteness meant in the world. So like I said, I did a deep dive and then started to notice things around me. And that's when things changed for me. That's when I came back to the university, I immediately, rather than just focusing on, sociology in the Department of Sociology, actually ended up in women's and ethnic studies. And I was teaching there and I taught there for almost the rest of my career. So that was very early on in my understanding. In the meantime, I've been very involved in not only learning, but also teaching, doing train the trainer programs, and also working with organizations across the country. Someone will have read one of my books and said, hey, can you come and speak or come and do a book club? Or Can you help us with our strategic plan? And that happens to be what my doctorate is in leadership development and also research and policy. So creating policy and all of those things. And so what ended up happening was between organizations, corporations, nonprofits, all of these and campuses, about almost 3 years ago now, I left the university. I left my tenured position to consult full time because I felt like I was being drawn and invited to, whether it be organizations like NASA or the military or Facebook, or these are all some of my extensive list of clients. So I feel so honored to be able to do this kind of work in so many different places and so many different venues and organizations. Mm-hmm.
If I can interrupt you, Dr. Dena Samuels, I think you mentioned a few other topics that when I was a former traditional HR person, it used to always be just about sexual harassment, gender, and disability as the three primary. And you just mentioned multiple other topics around discrimination.
Yes.
And it sounds like you realized that you had to go back to school to go, wow, this is like expanding.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you think that's a real trend, and particularly in the United States?
Well, so two things. I mean, my brain goes in two different directions when you ask that question. So I want to honor both, in the sense that the work that I do is all intersectional. And for those who are less familiar with the word, it really just means that we're talking about not just race, but also gender, sexuality, all these different social identities, class, age, ability, all of those pieces, right? And because all of these identities, these social identities actually make up who we are and what our experience is in the world, right? I may be a white, I'm received as a white woman, right? But my experience as a white woman who, identifies as Jewish might be different from a white woman who identifies as Christian. So that's a religious difference, right? And so we need to think about all of these pieces coming together and the ways in which sometimes we get benefits from those social identities, and sometimes we might be on the discrimination end, where we are on the receiving end of things like microaggressions or stereotype threat and those kind of pieces. So so both of those are important. What I'm seeing as a trend today, first of all, most organizations are looking at intersectionality, right? They want to know the language. What language do I use around, for example, transgender? Like, what does that mean? And how do I interact with folks who maybe I haven't had experience with transgender communities? And so I'm wanting to do that, and I don't know how. So I can come in and talk about that. But overwhelmingly, especially in this past year, 2020, most organizations are really looking at race in their organizations. And that's, I think, why we're here today, is because it's such a hot topic. And it's not to say that this struggle has not been going on for literally hundreds of years. And it's not like George Floyd's murder was the first or last or any of that, but something shifted at that moment in our history. And more and more organizations and corporations and all of that are now saying, I know I need to be doing something, but I'm not quite sure what it is I need to be doing. And so that's where I come in, and I can help figure out, how do we have those conversations in the workplace, which I think we need to be doing.
Yes, because as a younger HR person and a chief HR officer of a grocery distributor, we had a transgender employee. And now I reflect back, and I did my best as a junior HR person, but now I think I would have handled that whole circumstance extremely differently, learning from you. So I greatly appreciate that. It's more than just, it's many topics.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That intersectional piece is key. And even when we talk about race, we can't we can't just talk about race, right? It can be, because there's a system in place that's benefiting some and discriminating against others, right? And so we have to look at that and thinking about, for example, white supremacist ideology. That's really what we're talking about here, right? And that's a deep dive. When I come into an organization, I don't really do diversity 101 because we don't have time for that. There's change that needs to happen in all of our organizations and all our institutions. And we don't want to keep it light. We need to kind of take a deep dive. That said, we don't want to come in and beat anybody up or make them feel blamed or shamed either. The work that I do is really trying to come with some compassion, because we cannot create the system that exists, right? It's not our fault that it is the way it is. But now that we know that it exists the way it does, we need to do something about it. So what does that look like?
So what I hear from you is that you actually have some overlapping aspects. Your Jewish background, you said you're trisexual, your gender affiliation, and I would say in my experience as an HR person, I also experienced that because I was the one. I had like well over 1,000 at one point, 3,000 employees, because we had turnover in HR, surprisingly. Anyway, where they would come in and they would say, I have this aspect, I have a disability, I'm Black, this is my religion, and it's all overlapping.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to admit, we used to have a former panelist who indicated as an expert in culture that she admitted that she made some faux pas and just some of the language that she was using. And luckily they gave her some feedback and said, that's offensive to our predominantly Black workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just typecasted into one category. I think understanding all of it, I don't know if you can call it, but I mean, understanding all the dimensions. And I think it's getting stronger and stronger. Now in Puerto Vallarta, I happen to live next to what's called the romantic zone, or close to the romantic zone, and which is predominantly a gay community.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that community, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of friendships made, such as my hairstylist, which I need my hair done. But anyway, but I mean, it's interesting. I've talked to him as a hairstylist because, hairstylists see constant clients all day long. And he did explain to me how he's treated so differently by different clients. And now, I mean, granted, he owns his own company, but he did give, as an HR person, talent management person, I was very curious, how different are your clients treating you? And what language are they using? It's funny that you're on right now. This is perfect. And he was trying to describe to me the confusion and the offensiveness when they don't know that they're being offensive. So how are you helping to educate about, I mean, there's so much information to teach. I mean, how are you aligning it so that an executive can understand? Because I mean, I've worked with many executives, and no offense, they don't understand the complexities of this. So how are you doing that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't, it's when they call me, it's usually they understand that there's something they need to know that they don't know. And that's really what I do. I mean, I would say if there was one thing to describe how I show up and what I do, it's teaching people what they don't know, right? And we're all in this together. I am considered an expert, but I'm also learning all the time. There's no way that I'm gonna, in my lifetime, gonna be able to learn everything there is to know about every culture. So I'm always having a learning curve myself, right? And so we're all, it's a lifelong journey. That said, That doesn't mean, just because it is a lifelong journey doesn't mean we don't need to start it if we're not on that journey already. So, and so what I try to do when I come into an organization is try to assess, and this is through asking a lot of questions. I have a blog on this in particular on my website that is 5 things to consider when you're hiring a diversity and inclusion consultant, whether it's me or someone else. These are things that the consultant should be asking, and so one of the things I do is I try to say, where are you? Where is the organization right now? And by the way, the person that I'm speaking to typically has a little bit of a broader view, but knows their organization well enough to say, yeah, they don't really understand this piece, or they don't understand that piece, or and so that's helpful to me, because then I can come in and meet people where they are, rather than just, dumping some information on their lap and in their lap and saying, okay, do with it what you will. I want to meet them where they are, because otherwise it's a waste of time. And in fact, the studies show it can do more harm than good. If I were to come and speak either above them or below them or whatever, that they're not going to relate, they're not going to connect with me, and therefore we're not going to be able to be as effective as we would otherwise. So I think that piece is really important to understand. And then coming in and saying, here's what I recommend. Usually, to your point, Shar, it's not just a one and done. It's got to be sort of a series and ongoing. And again, I've done all the research on this because it's in one of my books as well. Just thinking about what diversity training what bad diversity training can look like, and what we need to be doing, and some of the questions, the really reflective questions we need to be asking, especially leadership and especially HR folks, to think about for themselves, and then they can come at their work a little bit more from a broader perspective and understanding. And so I think that's all very important. But starting with, thinking about social identities, thinking about the inequalities that exist, looking at implicit bias, looking at microaggressions and how to handle microaggressions when they come up. Microaggressions, some people call them micro inequities. The idea that, as you were saying, Shar, when those comments or behaviors happen, what do you do in that moment? How do you intervene? How do you challenge them? Because what happens in our culture often is they go unchallenged. And when they go unchallenged, people think it's okay to say what they're saying or do what they're doing. And as we all know, when you do what you've always done, you get what you've always gotten, and that will lead to more inequalities.
Right.
So yeah, we need to do it differently.
So Dr. Samuels, can you give us an example of or we can define some of these things, microaggressions, implicit bias, and so forth. And so let's start with microaggressions. I mean, what is it, and what are some examples of that?
I'm going to, if it's okay, flip those around and start with implicit bias, only because I always believe that we need to begin within. So one of the things I'm sure I've said on here before, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's worth repeating, is oftentimes we hold up a window and we point out the window and say, we have to change that policy and that policy and that policy. And that's all true. We do need to do that. What I do when I come in into an organization is I transform the window into a mirror. And I always say it's a gentle reflection, right? With a big heart and compassion, a gentle reflection. It's not a harsh glare staring at ourselves, but more like meeting ourselves where we are, and with compassion that, okay, I learned some things I didn't even know were a problem. So what do I do next? And to me, once you get that idea that we all need to take a little bit of personal responsibility for shifting, then it's a matter of understanding, how do these biases that we all have, if you have a brain, you're biased. Every human being has biases. All bias means really is preference. And, we have a bias for this color over that color. We have a bias over what we like to eat versus what we don't. We have lots of biases. The biases that I talk about are the ones that actually affect our interactions with others, and especially when we're hiring or making life-changing decisions about another human being. That's when it's critically important that we start thinking, wait a minute, what is this bias? Where did it come from? And what am I going to do now that I know it's there? So, I always suggest folks look into the implicit association test. That's Harvard University's Project Implicit. And at least get a baseline for understanding what biases you have. And the beauty of that resource, because that's really what it is in 5 minutes, you will know, you get a score right away that tells you what's going on in your brain. So it's a phenomenal resource, and well cited in the academy in particular, right?
Could you tell us that source once more time?
Yeah, it's implicit.harvard.edu is the website, and it's if you look it up, it's Harvard University's Project Implicit.
Wow. So thank you. It's in the chat right now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And is it also on your website?
So on my website, I have resources, and yes, you can get there. You look up, I have handouts that folks can download as well, but on the resources page, you can see there's one on implicit bias, and it gives a little bit of a background on what implicit bias is. And then it gives the source. So you can actually just click right there and go and take a test. And there are tests on race, there are tests on gender, sexuality, all of these different social identities. And my recommendation for everyone is to take as many different ones as you possibly can. Because if you just, I always say, start with the race one, so but
right.
Also, keep looking and seeing, oh, I didn't even know I had a bias here, a bias there. So it's a great starting place.
Hi, Jules. Do we have
Jules?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Samuels, but we have a question here about, can you give some examples how to best challenge microaggressions?
I will. We're just going to get there. Once we get to, I just want to finish up with implicit bias because it's important. And yes, I promise, Jules, to answer that one.
Yeah.
But the implicit bias, as I said, we begin within, so we understand what's happening in our brains, right? And understand that process. And then we can't stop there. We can't just take a test and go, oh, well, now I know, and so now I'm good to go. We have to actually do some learning about what do we do to minimize bias? What are bias triggers? That's what we call them, bias triggers in our organization. It might be how we're the process for our hiring processes and things like that. It's really important that we do sort of an audit of what our processes are and where the biases might show up that we might need to challenge. That's a whole training in and of itself, but I strongly recommend folks do that. So taking the test first, and then figuring out, what do I do? How do we minimize bias, the biases that we have?
Well, if I could quickly just say a short little example of my personal experience.
Yeah.
Okay. So you are seeing a person that's changed a lot, even since you were on last time. Mm-hmm. Also, I own a company that has, I think it's now up to 6 locations, each and predominantly in malls. And each mall is in a very different section of town. For example, one of our malls is in Aurora, Colorado. So if any of you are paying attention to what's happening in Aurora, there are a lot of social unrest in Aurora, even to the point where the mall has to close early because of gang violence. And so, of course, we're looking out for the safety of our staff in Aurora. Now, what's challenging is we have a gentleman that works there that also works in a wheelchair. And he's a gem because he even says, I fly under the radar a little bit. But he's worked out ways, like with his face shield. He wears a face shield and a face mask. And he's put Black Lives Matter stickers and equality stickers on his face mask to show, one, I'm in a wheelchair, and 2, that I am open to diversity and I'm open to, all cultures.
Mhm.
And he even said to me that he's even had to change his mindset, because his original mindset was all about disability discrimination.
Mhm.
And then now that he works in this location, he's like, wow, there is really a lot more, I'm sorry, you call it gender bias,
Mhm.
or
Sure.
gender, racial,
Mhm.
um, the LBGT community, if I can say it correctly. Uh, and also that particular mall has a high Hispanic population.
Mhm.
And we have found that our female Hispanic leader and leaders or employees have been the most successful in our company. And there's a high Hispanic population. Now,
Mhm.
meanwhile, we have other locations. We are in, believe it or not, uh, we're in Rocky Flats, and we're in Park Meadows, and we're in Colorado Mills, and we're also in Montana. And
Very,
I know, and
very.
I know I'm forgetting one. Anyway, all of those locations from a leadership perspective have had to acknowledge that this particular topic is very unique, and also affect their productivity of how they relate with their local communities.
Mhm.
And so we have had to be more open and authentic, and talk about it. And it's not an easy topic to talk about, right? Not only because we're a very diverse company, but also the fact that they relate with a very diverse community.
Mhm.
So when I was a traditional HR leader and I wasn't in charge of running a company, we had a diversity person, and his was all about just race.
Mhm.
And I, now looking back, no offense to that individual if he's watching me, now wonder why we only focused on race.
Mhm.
We didn't focus on all the other topics. But now, as a company owner, now I'm truly in the face of realizing this really truly affects business,
Mhm.
and that you really do need to do some kind of analysis or discussion. And so that particular link you say, is that free?
It's free. Yes. Good point. Mhm.
And or we hire a professional such as you that could really help us look at that situation,
Mhm.
and really help our leaders excel and be more agile,
That's right.
and adapting to the environmental factors around diversity and inclusion.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to make that point, because I'm a fairly new business owner, and I've really opened my eyes to that particular topic.
Mhm. Yeah. I'd love to move on to thinking. I know that was a really cursory look at implicit bias, but at least we, got sort of the basics in. I'd like to talk also about microaggressions because, with all the questions, microaggressions are basically the invalidations that happen throughout the day. There can be racial microaggressions, there can be ones based on gender, sexuality, ability, all of those. And they're basically the comments or behaviors or slights that happen typically against somebody who has a non-dominant social identity. And the culmination of microaggressions, like the people who are, if you were to microaggress, right? You said something that the way to know it's a microaggression is you didn't mean it. Like you didn't say it out of harm. If you said it or did it, whatever the behavior is, out of to harm someone, that's no longer a microaggression. That is a whole different category, right? Now you're talking about safety issues, physical safety issues, and all of that. When we think about microaggressions, we have to consider that first and foremost. Is the person meaning harm when they said what they said? And if it's pretty obvious the person has no clue, had no idea that they said something, that's when we would call it a microaggression. And what I do in my trainings is actually teach folks how to unpack a microaggression. What are the underlying message? what's the intent, and primarily what's the impact? Like, that's really important to think about, is what's the impact, not only on the person who was on the receiving end, but anyone else who heard the comment. If it's not challenged, if it goes unchallenged, it will be continued, right? Like, nobody, if it goes unchallenged, people don't realize, people aren't learning anything. They're not going to be able to do anything different. Unfortunately, most of the time, we leave it to the person who has been on the receiving end of the microaggression to actually stand up for themselves or their social identity group, right? And that's a lot of work. I mean, if you get that, if you get a microaggression at the beginning of the day, Dr. Daryl Wing Sue, S-U-E, wrote a book called Microaggressions in Everyday Life. And that's probably my favorite one. There's a bunch of books out now on microaggressions, but he was sort of really exploded the idea, the concept. And when the fact that most people know what microaggressions are is mostly due to him and his work. And so what he says is that microaggressions are like paper cuts. So that, you get one at the beginning of the day, you kind of roll your eyes and shrug your shoulders and go, do I have time to challenge this or not? You get another one, another one, another one. By the end of the day, you're actually bleeding. And we know from the research that over the course of a lifetime, we're talking about higher mortality rates for people who get more microaggressions, who are on the receiving end. So we're talking about life or death here. It's not a minimal thing. Oh, I'll just let that one go. But the person who's on the receiving end has to, every time it happens, think about, do I have the mental capacity? Do I even have the time to engage in this right now? So to flip that paradigm, what if the people around, who are bystanders, so to speak, I call them going from bystanders to upstanders, if they were trained and they knew what to do to step in and say, that's not okay, in a gentle way, right? So that you're calling the person who microaggressed in rather than calling them out, right? So, and when I think about it, I heard recently the idea of calling on, because I shift from calling out to calling in, but also calling on. Like, we want folks to feel like they are called on to actually engage in this work, and that they're going to step up and really do the right thing. That's how change will happen in an organization, in a culture. Mm-hmm.
So may I ask you a question? Are you speaking verbal microaggression, or are you speaking nonverbal microaggression?
It could be either. It could be either. Again, when you say nonverbal, it could be an expression on your face. It could be something as subtle as somebody comes into your space, you're talking with, you're engaged, and rather than opening up to invite the new person in, you don't, you don't even shift your body. Now, granted, in COVID, it's now all on screen and all of that, but hopefully we'll get to be in person again. And literally that shifting or smiling at somebody or not smiling at them could be received as a microaggression, like, I'm not welcome here. And that's really the underlying message of most microaggressions. You are not welcome here.
Well, speaking of not welcome or inviting in, Sumit, I noticed you turned your mute off. Sumit, did you have some thoughts about this topic?
So absolutely. Thank you, Shar. Of course, the concept of race isn't as prevalent in my country, but I've done a little bit of work with folks in other geographies. And would it be fair to say that because you're from a particular race, or you seem to be from a certain socio-economic background, somebody in supermarket security following you around the aisle would be a microaggression? So somebody assuming that you're there to steal, no gestures, no words exchanged, but they're just following you around.
Yes, and so that would be, that could turn into something different than a microaggression, right? So I want to be very clear. That could be a very serious safety issue for the person who's being followed. But what's happening in the brain of the person who's following right? There's some bias going on, automatic, unconscious, implicit bias. So we need to be thinking about that in terms of our employers. What we hear oftentimes is, well, I followed, or I stopped that person, if it were police, because, yes, I did some racial profiling, but I should be, because that's who commits the crimes. Like, I've heard those kinds of sentiments in the past. And that is the biggest misnomer. When you think about, when you unpack all of that, you realize that the reason we have more, that folks of color, BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are overrepresented in the prison system, in the legal system, and down the chain, is not because they're committing more crimes. It's because of racial profiling. That they're the ones who are more likely to get into the system, whereas a white person who did the same crime is much more likely to get away with it. So that in and of itself is how our society has perpetuated what I call white supremacist, and is called by many scholars too as white supremacist ideology, that if you're white, that you're trustworthy. And this is one of the biggest problems and biggest myths we have in our society. And a lot of white folks are getting away with a lot of stuff because of it, and taking advantage of that. Yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
Well, I
Yes,
have
actually.
to say, go ahead. I would just have to say, I feel the reason why I this whole Mexico experience has really opened my eyes to it is because although the gringos and the white Americans are valued because of our economy and the fact that we buy a lot of products down here, I noticed that when my fiance Bruce was out of town, I was treated extremely differently by the Mexican male community. I was treated differently. I was talked to differently. I was downgraded, and it wasn't because I had a male around me. Now, not to get into a long story about that, but that was like the first time in my life that I went, wow, I really need to get a tan. No, it really just made me realize that even as a white female, how, and I started paying attention to the females in the community. No offense to the Mexican community, but the females are very quiet and docile and don't say a lot. I'm a very strong, outgoing, opinionated, blah, 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 it's hard to change my personality to fit in, you know what I'm saying? So that really kind of opened my eyes. Like I am going back to the United States at the end of the month, and I do plan to have a leadership discussion, because my perspective about diversity and inclusion and having that awareness, I think, needs to be even deeper than ever. And it's not because of how I feel I was treated for a few weeks down here, but I think that now I see it differently. And you're not going to see it by taking a class or taking an online class or having a leadership meeting. I really think it needs heart-to-heart conversation, deep discussion with your employees about this topic. Right? I mean, unless you have other ideas.
Well, I do. I mean, I could say a lot. And as you were talking about your own experience, I don't know if folks could pull apart all of the different social identities you were talking about. So you were
Right.
talking about race, you were talking about your gender, you were talking about your economic, socioeconomic status. Like, that's the way intersectionality comes together. And so we could have a whole nother conversation about that, but I want to instead focus really on your last question about what do we do? Like, how do we do this? And I do believe that those conversations around race need to be facilitated by people who have had the training and the experience to do so. Again, it's what I do, but there's plenty of other great facilitators out there. The reason for that is that I think people think, oh, I really want to dig in and I'm going to jump in and do this. And, and then they get in and they get into a lot of trouble. They don't realize that they might even be microaggressing and causing more harm than good in an organization. So again, as I said, whether it's me or someone else, another great facilitator, that's up to folks, but I wouldn't, unless you have somebody who's skilled, I would not, I just think it's really
but I guess my strategy, and let me know about my idea, is I mean, I focus with my company. I have a very small company. We're getting closer to 30 employees now. And we were just at 20 about a month ago.
Wow.
But anyway, I think I would like to invite those employees that perceive themselves voluntarily, because I don't want to pick and choose. Are you Black? Are you Hispanic? Are you disabled? Are you lesbian? I would like to have those volunteer to maybe have a subgroup, and then we strategize about a team meeting. And I would like those individuals to kind of lead the discussion and have the psychological safety to be able to talk about it. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think it's a good starting point, but I also think, do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan of any sort?
We are starting to work on that, and in May we are, because we do what's called this TMA that we talk about. I am developing our brand new talent management strategy, which is very different than what I did in my old life as a former HR person. And I think I'd like to add a whole new section. So I think I'd like to create a whole new diversity and inclusion strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
yes, your advice is awesome.
Yeah, so you're not alone, but I do think that that's a really important starting place. Is that, and it doesn't have to be, I always talk to my clients about, it doesn't have to be this 30-page document because that sits on a shelf. It's got to be a working document, and it needs to include a vision, a mission, and objectives of what it is you are planning to do. How do you, and what are the benchmarks, and who's going to be held accountable? It could be just a few pages, but this is what I help my clients do as well, is to create that, to work with if you have a team of folks, I would sit with your group of people who are really engaged and are excited about doing this work. And we come up with a plan of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And how do you know you've succeeded? How do you know, if without benchmarks along the way, how do you know you're headed in a good direction? Mm-hmm. And so part of those benchmarks might be trainings like implicit bias training or microaggressions training, or what if you're the microaggressor and somebody approaches you, what do you do? So those are all incorporated in what I do. But like I said, it's me or others. There are plenty of other great folks out there. But I do think it takes somebody with the expertise specifically in this area if you want to do it well.
I agree. Absolutely. Jules, did you have a comment?
Yeah, we have 2 questions. So this one's kind of a couple of parts, so bear with me. So we have, how does identifying microaggressions and recognizing them in others help us overcome teaming issues? Beyond accepting diversity in the workplace, what is the next step to help a team prosper and grow above a moment of microaggression? Do we acknowledge situations like this and call out team members, which I think you touched on a little earlier? Is this a good approach, or do we try to understand where these statements are coming from? Yeah, so we kind of touched on that, but yeah, how basically, how does identifying these microaggressions help overcome teaming issues, and what would be the next step once we know that this is going on? How do we grow above it, and what is the next step to help the team prosper?
Great, thanks, Jules. So first, I would say that microaggressions are happening everywhere in every organization every day. So if folks are thinking, well, it doesn't happen here, whatever, it's because you don't notice it. It is happening. I can guarantee it. I've never been in an organization that I haven't seen anything. And that's not to put blame or shame or anything. It's doing what we don't know is problematic, right? It's what we don't know, we don't know. So I love what you read, Jules, in terms of the person who asked the question is saying, you know, should we find out where they're coming from? Should we acknowledge? Absolutely, 100%. We want to bring these things to the surface. When we bring them to the surface, if they're done in a constructive way, what it does is it allows people to know, oh, we're actually making progress in this. We're not just doing, you know, lip service, as we say, right? It's not just about sugarcoating or any of that, or saying, you know, when after George Floyd's murder last summer, there was a lot of organizations writing letters to their teams and sending it out to all their employees. And I'm thinking, okay, this is great that you're sending a letter out. I think that's appropriate, but what's the next step? You can't just send a letter out saying this is terrible tragedy and this is horrible and whatever, and we're committed to whatever, without actually doing something about it. So what's the next step for you? How are you engaging? We want, you know, ultimately, I love the concept of belongingness, that we want people to feel that your organization is their home away from home. And we can't do that across the board. We know diversity works. We want a diverse workforce. We want diverse customers too. And we can't have that unless we're doing our own work. And so it's hard work, it's challenging work. I'm not going to say there's an easy fix or take this pill and boom, you're done. It is a journey. But if you're not on the journey, you are now behind the times, because the organizations that are doing well and that will continue to succeed as we move through the century are going to become more and more diverse. And we know they're going to be filled more and more with millennials, and millennials want diversity in their workforce. And they want diversity to be foundational to the organization. So this is, again, if you're not doing it, you're missing out, and you're not going to be on the leading edge of this, and you're not going to get the best talent.
And I think that, thank you so much for saying that, because I think a great place to practice is in your own personal life. So my example was right after the George Floyd incident, just going to the grocery store. I was in a Home Depot, and everybody was behind their masks. And in Colorado, I happen to live in a very Black community. I have a nice house, Black community, and they recently have had some tragic, like a house was burned down in this community. A family of 5 Black people were killed. If you heard about that story. Anyway, in the Home Depot, it's like now we have masks on, and so now it's all about the eyes. Yes. So when you talk about that micro, it's like, are you making eye contact? Mm-hmm. Are you making friendly eyes? And one day I was walking in a parking lot, and this Black man and his wife gave me a beautiful smile in their eyes. And they just said, hello, how are you doing today? And I went, I'm great, how are you? And that was in a Home Depot parking lot. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that had just happened after all those tragic events, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a good way to practice is in your life, in the grocery stores, and in your schools, and in your life, and then of course talk about it in your companies. So I think that's a fantastic idea. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Dr. Samuels. It's a very, very good idea.
Absolutely, thanks. Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in with one more question from our audience before we start to wrap things up? Someone is wondering what you have to say about companies who are supporting training regarding white privilege and telling employees to be less white, specifically Coke, who has had a recent backlash for such training. And they're wondering if you teach and train about reverse discrimination.
Okay, so just statistically speaking, reverse discrimination is not a thing. It's actually, the research shows that it's the media that has put out this concept of reverse discrimination. Not that it's 0% of the time, but it's pretty close. It rarely, when you look in the legal, the lawsuits and all of that, it's very rare. Usually when somebody says it's been reverse discrimination, when they look a little deeper, they find out, oh no, this person really wasn't as qualified as the person who got the job, and so reverse discrimination, for folks who are unaware, don't understand what it is. It's the concept, and as I said, it's a myth. Excuse me. It's a myth that white folks are losing out because of being discriminated against as a white person. To answer the question about white privilege, I do think we need to be talking about whiteness. We need to be, because that's a system, and it's not to blame or shame white people, right? If we're blaming or shaming white people, we're never going to get anywhere on equality or equity. What we need to be doing instead is looking at the way whiteness in our culture over our history has benefited some at the expense of others. And so I would never say to somebody, be less white. I think that I don't even know what that means, to be honest with you. But to minimize your whiteness, like, none of that makes any sense to me. What matters to me is that everyone has a sense of belonging. So when they come into the organization, they feel like they're there, they're welcomed, they feel included, and all of that. That includes white folks too, right? So this is not any kind of challenge or bashing or whatever against white folks. It's more like seeing what the system is doing. And, I identify as white myself. So I'm within a system and I see, wow, I didn't even realize before I was educated, which, Sharp, to your point from before, I think we need training, because it's not going to be just having a conversation without any training. People are still within the context of this hierarchy that we actually have in our society. And if you don't look at that society and unpack it, or look at the hierarchy and unpack it, you may end up feeling some kind of way about, feeling shamed or blamed or whatever. And so doing that in a way that calls, as I said before, calls folks into the conversation, I think is what's most important, what's critical. And I also think it's what's going to be most effective in the long run in terms of having these conversations. And what's most important to me, which is building relationships across social differences, which we're not doing because we don't know how, and we're afraid to in our society. And that's a big, huge sweeping over generalization. But when you look at the statistics, it's really true. We're more segregated today than we were during the civil rights era. And we, in terms of housing and everything else, we are not building relationships across difference overwhelmingly. And we need to be. We really need to be.
I am very surprised that we're getting worse. Mm-hmm. And I completely agree with you. And so thank you so much. I think what you're saying is spot on. And it's a very important topic that we're talking about this today. And it takes bravery and trust to be able to do that and be vulnerable as a leader to be able to talk about it. So thank you so much for bringing up this very important topic.
It's my pleasure.
Well, I know we're getting towards the top of the hour, so I know this is a great conversation, but I want to acknowledge our sponsor once more and take a few more questions as we come to a close here. So as we started off in the beginning, we talked about the TMA method, and part of this method is to understand your people, to have these critical discussions. And so what we offer is one of these TMA assessments. And so if you give this to your people, they can take that assessment, and it gives you an opportunity to go through it together to learn about their work preferences, to learn about their talents and their concerns in the workplace. And so it can be a great dialogue to have. And so what I'll do is release a quick poll here. If you would like to sign up and to have time with anybody on the call today, or even to go through a TMA assessment, we offer those for free. And also with a consultation of how you can use this methodology with yourself or with your team and so forth. So feel free to sign up there. So Jules, do we have some more questions that we should bring up for Dr. Samuels?
Yeah, we have one last one here. Diversity and inclusion has been a popular topic for many years, but it's programmatic, not consistent. Do you think it's here to stay?
Oh, definitely. There's not a question in my mind. In fact, what we call diversity training back in the day it continues to morph and change, right? As we talked about, even in the conversation this morning, or maybe this evening, wherever you are, that it's that intersectionality is becoming, more and more the case, like that people are talking across differences. So when you see the changes that have happened, when we say diversity and inclusion work or training or education or whatever language we want to use to talk about this work in general, it will continue to change, right? Even our language has changed, right? We used to say people of color. Now, more and more people are using the term BIPOC. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, to kind of show that it's not just one monolith of experience if you're not white, right? That it's a Black person's experience might be different than a Latinx person's experience or an Indigenous person's experience. And so it will continue to change and grow. Is absolutely here to stay. There's no question.
Well, I know we're approaching the top of the hour here, and I just have a final question for you, Dr. Samuels. So as a company or leadership looking, they know that they have a problem. They know that they need to address these issues in their organization and maybe get in front of that issue. And they have a lot of people out there as far as experts on this topic. And you yourself, I mean, being a white female and talking on the concept of diversity, how should a leader take that in consideration when selecting a person for their demographic?
I love that question. Most people don't think to ask that question. So I really appreciate it. I do think it's important. What I usually ask my clients, and my clients, again, could be heads of company leadership, it could be HR leadership. Those are the people that I'm speaking to who are hiring, hiring me directly. And I say to them to please to consider, if I'm going to come in and be talking to your entire leadership team or your entire organization, employees, maybe from 5 people to 50,000 people or more, that to really think about who will speak this information that your organization will receive the best. So for example, if you've got a lot of folks of color in your organization, you might think about hiring a consultant who is a person of color, right? That may be automatically a little bit more buy-in. That's not to say that there aren't, there's differences in styles and all of that. But at the end of the day, if your organization is primarily white, you might want to think about hiring a white consultant. And the reason I say that is because my colleagues of color and I maybe, we may have different styles and all of that, but we are pretty much giving the same kind of information. I mean, we all have our differences in our expertise and how we deliver the information. But at the end of the day, who's going to be in leading the discussion where the people in your organization are going to be able to receive it. So I think it's a really important question to consider, that don't you want to hire the best person for the job, but thinking about what does that look like for you and your organization.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So how can our listeners learn more about you and your services?
Easiest is just to go to my website, which is my name, denasamuels.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the discussion today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Samuels.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I wish everyone psychological, emotional, physical safety as you proceed in these conversations. And I hope that we are all able to continue to maintain more and more health as time goes on.
Great.
Well, we appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Wish we had more time just to keep it going, because
Yeah.
Yeah.
important topic. I mean, as someone from Australia, like we growing up, like, and coming out here, I like discovered my own ignorance, because I was like, oh, in Australia, like, it's multicultural, but it's a different, like here you're coming to a different history, and there's, it's a whole different thing. And I realized my own ignorance, and I've been learning and kind of, discovering new things and trying to do better, because, like you said, what you don't know, you don't know. But it's important that we start recognizing those things that we have, or where we've come from, and it's never too late to change, because another point you made was, if you keep doing the same thing, you're always going to get that inequality. So if we just start changing and evolving, it can only get better, right? So
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. You have a wonderful week, and see you next week.
next
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.